Welcome to Story Planet, where every quiet night begins with a story just for you. Tonight, let's meet Raymond, a man who found peace in his garden and comfort in a voice that arrived at 10, and Rosemary, who listened too, alone at first, until their hearts met between the words. So settle in, sip something warm, and let the story find its way to you. In a quiet part of the countryside, tucked between sleepy hills and whispering hedges, there lived a man named Raymond. He wasn't too old, not quite gray from top to toe, but old enough to be comfortable in silence and in the soft rhythm of his days. His home was a small stone cottage, one with a crooked chimney and shutters that creaked kindly in the wind. Ivy curled up one side, as if the earth itself was reaching up to wrap him in a leafy hug. Raymond had retired a few years ago, not with a bang, but with a quiet sigh and a teacup raised to no one in particular. He had once been a bookkeeper in the city, a man of order, of tidy columns and exact change. But now he spent his mornings with mint and marigolds, and his afternoons with carrots and calendula. Yes, Raymond was a man of herbs and roots and good old-fashioned vegetables. He lived simply, and he loved it. Each morning he brewed his tea with fresh thyme, plucked just moments before. Then he walked barefoot through his small patch of earth, inspecting the sprigs of rosemary, the sleepy lettuce heads, and the peas that reached for the sun like hopeful children. He bought whatever else he needed from the nearby village market: milk in glass bottles, handmade soap, the occasional cinnamon bun. The market came to life only once a week, but for Raymond, that was more than enough. He didn't need company, not really. He had his soil, his seeds, and his stories. Because you see, each night, at exactly 9:50 p.m., Raymond would finish washing his cup, fold his tea towel with precision, and walk to his bedroom. He would turn on the little lamp by his bedside, fluff the second pillow, just in case sleep needed a softer landing, and crawl under his woolen blanket. And there, on the small wooden stool beside his bed, sat the love of his night, an old radio with warm knobs and a dial that clicked like the start of a song. He'd tuned it just right, so there was no static, no nonsense, only the sound he waited for all day. At exactly 10 o'clock p.m., a gentle chime rang out, followed by the softest voice he had ever known. Good evening, and welcome to 10 o'clock Tales, where stories drift in like dreams. Oh, what a voice it was. It didn't announce, it invited. Each tale was like a blanket wrapped around his tired heart. Stories of shopkeepers who danced under the moon, of letters found in jars, of friendships that bloomed in unexpected places. And the woman who read them never said her name. She didn't need to. To Raymond, she was simply her. The voice that waited for him, that never rushed, that always made the world feel like it made sense again. He never made it to the end of the stories, not because he didn't want to, but because somewhere between the words, his eyes would close, his chest would rise in quiet rhythm, and sleep would take him like a child tucked into safety. And every morning, he'd wake up with the radio still there beside him, like a silent witness to dreams. It was his ritual. His clock didn't tell time. His radio did. Neighbors might have thought he was lonely, but Raymond knew better. He had stories and soil and silence that didn't ache. And so, the seasons passed. Rain tapped against his window in October. Snow curled around his boots in January, and daffodils peeked from the hedges by March. The world spun on, and Raymond remained, a steady note in a gentle song. But then, one night, it happened. After the usual tale, a story about an old woman who painted stars on the walls of her cottage. The familiar voice returned, but this time it trembled. "Dear listeners, I have some news to share." Raymond sat up, heart thudding softly beneath his flannel shirt. "Our station will be going through some changes, and as part of a digital transition, 10 o'clock tales will come to a close in 2 weeks." She paused, just for a moment, then continued. "It has been my joy, my comfort, and my honor to spend these nights with you. Thank you for listening." Then came the chime, slower this time, as if even the bells were mourning. And then, silence. Raymond stared at the radio, blinking, as if it might take the words back. But it didn't. The room felt colder, even under the blanket. The window groaned softly in the night breeze, but it couldn't comfort him. He didn't sleep. Not that night. Not properly. For the first time in years, he watched the clock tick past 10, and still, his eyes remained open. The next morning, the tea didn't taste the same. The thyme didn't smell as strong. The carrots looked sad somehow. Raymond didn't say anything to anyone, but when Saturday came, he packed his little basket and walked to the market, just as he always did. Only this time, the world seemed louder and lonelier. He picked up some radishes, nodded to the honey man, and turned toward the jam stall. That's when it happened. As he murmured aloud, almost by accident, "How does one sleep without a story?" A woman nearby, arranging jars of golden marmalade, turned. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice lilting like a question wrapped in curiosity. "Did you say something about stories?" Raymond blinked, unsure. She tilted her head, her eyes soft. "Was it 10 o'clock tales?" He nodded. Her smile grew. "Not wide, but deep. I listened to every night since the very first episode." They stood there, among the baskets and jars, two strangers bound by bedtime. Neither of them knew it yet, but the story wasn't ending. It was just turning the page, to be continued. There's something about knowing someone else has listened to the same story, at the same hour, beneath the same moon, that makes the world feel smaller and warmer. After that unexpected moment at the market, Raymond couldn't stop thinking about the woman with the marmalade smile. Her name, as it turned out, was Rosemary. She had a little farm on the east side of the village, a crooked sign outside her gate that read Rose's Pantry, and the kind of garden that hummed with bees and smelled of lavender and apples. She lived alone too, not by loss, but by choice, and rhythm, and the quiet joy of a life shaped gently by time. "I call it quiet company," she had said, pouring him a cup of lemon balm tea the next afternoon. "Me and the sky, and the stories." Raymond smiled, because he understood exactly what she meant. What started as one shared conversation became two, then three, and soon, Rosemary began stopping by his cottage in the evenings. Sometimes she brought jam, sometimes warm bread wrapped in a clean cloth, and once, a small bunch of daisies that she insisted grew better when someone talked to them. Raymond began clearing the second chair on the porch, the one that had gathered dust and wind-blown leaves. They spoke about everything and nothing, about their pasts, about the nights they spent listening to 10 o'clock tales, and the quiet comfort of drifting into sleep just as the final words faded. And then, they began to share something new. They began telling stories to each other. Not always planned, not always made up. Sometimes it was a memory, like the time Raymond lost a shoe in a puddle and had to walk home laughing. Or the night Rosemary read poems by candlelight and imagined she was in a castle. Other times they created bedtime stories, like children would, about cats with magical umbrellas and trees that remembered lullabies. They didn't talk while the radio played. Not yet. At 9:50, like clockwork, they would make their way to Raymond's bedroom, the room that smelled of mint and beeswax, the woolen blanket tucked up to his chest, the old radio sitting faithful on its little stool. Rosemary would settle in the rocking chair by the window, and Raymond would reach out, tuning the dial, until the familiar chime greeted them. Good evening, and welcome to 10 o'clock tales, where stories drift in like dreams, and every night begins with just 4 little words. Once upon a time. They could see each other's contented feeling and a shared curiosity about what story would unfold tonight, and in that quiet moment, they both realized they carried the exact same feelings all along, and there they'd sit, 2 shadows in a pool of lamplight, listening together. But the clock was ticking. There were only 5 episodes left, then 4. Then 3. Each time the voice returned to say how grateful she was, how much the letters had meant, how stories mattered even if no one remembered who wrote them. Raymond and Rosemary said nothing, but their silence was full of understanding, of something soft and unspoken, something that had less to do with the radio and more to do with the feeling of being held by a story just before sleep. One evening, as the chime faded and the voice wished them good night, Rosemary stood, walked over to the radio, and gently touched its wooden frame. "Do you think," she whispered, "that when it's gone, we'll miss it too much?" Raymond didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand instead. Soft, warm, lightly dusted with flour. "No," he said, "because I think we were always meant to tell each other stories." She looked at him, eyes glistening like rain over tilled soil, and then she smiled, that deep, quiet smile. They began spending more time together, mornings in the garden, afternoons trading seeds and recipes, and evenings waiting for the last of the stories. As the final broadcast neared, Rosemary brought over her old gramophone. "Thought we might need some backup," she chuckled. Raymond laughed, the kind of laugh that makes the air inside a house less lonely. The second-to-last episode was about a man who built a tiny boat out of matchsticks, set it in a puddle, and followed it until it disappeared, a story about letting go and finding something new. When the story ended, neither of them spoke, but Raymond reached across the bed and gently squeezed her hand. And Rosemary, without a word, leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder. One story remained, and they knew they would listen to it together. The night came softly, wrapped in mist, and the hush of wind brushing over rosemary leaves. Raymond had lit a single candle on the bedside table, though the lamp still glowed beside it, casting warm shadows on the walls. The cottage was quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. Rosemary arrived just before 9:30, a basket on her arm, a quiet look in her eyes. Inside the basket, 2 mugs of warm honey milk, a small plate of oat biscuits, and a folded blanket that smelled of sunshine and old quilts. No words were needed. She stepped inside, removed her shawl, and placed the basket on the foot of the bed. Raymond nodded softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, grateful for her company, for the weight of her presence in the quiet room. Tonight was the night, the last tale, the last time the voice would drift into the air, like a lullaby meant only for them. They sat together in the bed, side by side, legs under the blanket, the radio waiting on its stool. Raymond checked the dial, though it never needed checking. It was habit, like a prayer said not for belief, but for rhythm. Rosemary handed him his cup, and then took hers, fingers brushing lightly. The clock ticked, gently, kindly, and then it struck 10. The chime rang out, not rushed, not drawn, just perfect. Then came the voice. "Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to our final 10 o'clock tale." They both leaned slightly closer, unconsciously, as if they might catch every breath between the words. The story began. It was about an old postman who had walked the same path for 40 years, delivering letters by foot, rain or shine. On his last day, he delivered a letter to a house he had passed 1,000 times, but never stopped at. Inside the letter were the words, "Thank you for walking the world into my window." The story went on. The postman never knew who had written it, but every day after retiring, he walked the same route, not to deliver, but to wave, to greet, to keep being part of the story. By the end, Rosemary had tears in her eyes, and Raymond felt something tender press against his chest. Then came the voice again. "This show has never been about stories, not really. It's been about listening, feeling, remembering, and resting. Thank you for letting me be the last voice you hear before you sleep." She paused, the kind of pause that bends time. "Wherever you are and whoever you are, I hope you know you were never alone." The chime rang once more, and then silence. Rosemary placed her mug down gently, turned to Raymond, and without speaking, pulled the blanket higher around them both. They sat that way for a long time, not sleeping, just breathing. 2 hearts, still echoing with a voice now gone. Finally, Raymond turned to her. I don't think I was ever listening just for the stories, he said. Rosemary looked at him, her voice low, a whisper made of warmth. Me neither. I think I was listening for someone who was listening too. That night, they stayed up until dawn. They talked about every story they remembered, every letter that lingered, every voice that never left. They shared stories of their own, moments they'd never said aloud, memories that needed a voice. And when the sky turned pale and the birds began to sing, Raymond turned off the radio. He didn't need it anymore, not like before, because now there was another voice in the room, one he could hold. Morning came, not in a rush, but like the soft turning of a page. The sky outside Raymond's cottage was pale and wide, brushed with watercolor clouds, and the scent of rosemary drifted through the open window. Inside, the silence was gentle, not the kind that aches, but the kind that listens. Raymond was still in bed, the covers slightly tangled, the imprint of a second pillow still warm beside him. The radio sat quiet on its stool, but no one missed the sound it used to make, because across the room, in the little kitchen, with blue tiles and sun-warmed jars of honey, Rosemary stood at the stove, humming something she didn't know she remembered, stirring oats into milk, just the way he liked it. When Raymond joined her, slippers soft against the wooden floor, he smiled without words, and she smiled right back. That day, they didn't talk about what they had lost. They talked about what they still had, and what they could begin. They made plans for the herb garden, where to move the basil, whether thyme liked more sun, if the mint needed its own pot because it was greedy. They painted the fence at the back of the cottage, the one Raymond had always meant to get to. They picked out a new chair from the market for the porch, so she could sit beside him while the sky turned gold in the evenings. And at night, when the clock ticked its way toward 10, they didn't reach for the radio. Instead, they made tea, lit a candle, and took turns telling stories. The first night, Raymond told one about a boy who used to sleep under a library desk, who dreamed of becoming an astronaut, but became a bookkeeper instead, and still thought he'd touch the stars. Rosemary clapped when he finished, and said she liked his voice better than the radio anyway. The next night, she told a tale about a girl who used to make jam from wild berries and weave it on the steps of houses with lonely windows. She didn't know who lived there, but she hoped they smiled when they tasted it. Raymond did smile, and asked if the girl had ever gotten a thank you note. She got a visitor instead, Rosemary whispered, and kissed him on the cheek. And so the nights continued, not with chimes or announcements, but with laughter, with listening, and with the kind of closeness that doesn't need explaining. They began keeping a little notebook, just a small one, where they wrote down the titles of their made-up stories. The woman who painted the rain, the cat who taught kindness, the bench that remembered names. Some nights, they didn't tell stories at all. They just sat together, sharing the silence, watching the shadows dance on the walls, feeling time soften around them. One evening, Raymond reached for the radio, not to turn it on, but to dust it gently. He placed it on a shelf in the corner, gave it one last look, and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, and it almost felt like it whispered back. Years passed, not quickly, but kindly. The garden grew thick and green. The porch gathered more chairs, and people passing by often heard two voices, one telling stories, and the other laughing. The kind of laugh that makes everything feel like home. They never married, not formally, but they lived like vows had been spoken in every shared story, every cup of tea, every moment spent with the radio turned off. And when they grew older, when the silver in their hair grew brighter, and the steps to the garden slowed, the stories never stopped, because love, when it grows from listening, becomes a story that never needs an ending. On their last winter together, a neighbor asked Raymond if he ever missed the old radio tales. Raymond looked at Rosemary, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes still full of every story he'd ever needed. And he said, "No, I still hear them, every night, just in a different voice." And that night, like every night before it, the candle flickered, the blanket warmed their feet, and a new story began. A story written in the silence between words, in glances, and in love that arrived late, but just in time. The radio never played again, but neither of them noticed. Thank you for traveling with us. If Raymond and Rosemary's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of quiet nights and the beauty of being heard, consider giving it a gentle thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves silence, stories, and second chances. And if you haven't already, subscribe for over 100 bedtime tales, with many more still to come. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.